Hello everyone. So here we begin with part 2 of chapter number 8, the economic impact of British rule. The topic is ruin of old zamindari and rise of new landlordism. Here it goes. The first few decades of the British rule witnessed the ruin of the most of the old zamindars of Bengal and Madras. This was particularly so with Warren Hastings' policy of auctioning the rights of revenue collection to the highest bidders. The permanent settlement of 1793 also had a similar effect in the beginning. The heaviness of the land revenue, the government claimed 10/11 of the rental, and the rigid law of collection, under which the zamindari estates were ruthlessly sold in case of delay in payment of revenue, wreaked havoc for the first few years. Many of the great zamindars of the Bengal were utterly ruined and were forced to sell their zamindari rights. By 1815, nearly half of the landed property of Bengal had been transferred from the old zamindars who had resided in the villages and who had traditions of showing some consideration to their tenants to merchants and other moneyed classes who usually lived in towns and who were quite ruthless in collecting to the last pi what was due from tenant irrespective of the difficult circumstances. Being utterly unscrupulous and possessing little sympathy for tenants, they began to subject the latter to rack renting and ejectment. The permanent settlement in North Madras and temporary zamindari settlement in UP were equally harsh on the local zamindars. But the condition of the zamindars soon improved radically. In order to enable zamindars to pay the land revenue in time, the authorities increased their power over the tenants by extinguishing the traditional rights of tenants. The zamindars now set out to push up the rents to the utmost limit. Consequently, they rapidly grew in prosperity. In the Ryotwari areas too, the system of landlord-tenant relations spread gradually. As we have seen above, more and more land passed into the hands of moneylenders, merchants, and rich peasants who usually got the land cultivated by tenants. One reason why the Indian moneyed classes were keen to buy land and become landlords was the absence of effective outlets for investment of their capital in industry. Another process through which this landlordism spread was that of subletting. Many owner cultivators and occupancy tenants having a permanent right to hold land found it more convenient to lease out land to land hungry tenants at exorbitant rent than to cultivate it themselves. In time, landlordism became the main feature of agrarian relations not only in the zamindari areas but also in Ryotwari areas. The remarkable feature of the spread of landlordism was the growth of sub-infeudation and intermediaries. Since the cultivating tenants were generally unprotected and overcrowding of land led tenants to compete with one another to acquire land, the rent of land went on increasing. The zamindars and the new landlords found it convenient to sublet their right to collect rent to other eager persons on profitable terms. But as rents increased, subleasers of land in their turn to sublet their rights in land. Thus, by a chain process of large number of rent receiving intermediaries between the actual cultivator and the government sprang up. In some cases in Bengal, their number went as high as 50. The conditions of the helpless cultivating tenants who had ultimately to bear the burden of maintaining this horde of superior landlords was precarious beyond imagination. Many of them were little better than slaves. An extremely harmful consequence of rise and growth of zamindars and landlords was the political role they played during the India's struggle for independence. Along with the princes of protected states, many of them became the chief political supporters of the foreign rulers and opposed the rising national movement. Realizing that they owed their existence to the British rule, they tried hard to maintain and perpetuate it. Stagnation and deterioration of agriculture. As a result of overcrowding of agriculture, excessive land revenue demand, growth of landlordism, and increasing indebtedness and the growing impoverishment of the cultivators, Indian agriculture began to stagnate and even deteriorate, resulting in extreme low yields per acre. Overall, agricultural production fell by 14% between 1901 and 1939. The overcrowding of agriculture and increase in the subfeudation led to subdivision and fragmentation of land into small holdings, most of which could not maintain their cultivators. The extreme poverty of the overwhelming majority peasants left them without any resources with which to improve agriculture by using better cattle and seeds, more manure and fertilizers, and improved techniques of production. Nor did the cultivator rack rented by both the government and the landlord have any incentive to do so. After all, the land he cultivated was really his property, and the bulk of the benefit which agricultural improvements would bring was likely to be reaped by the horde of absentee landlords, moneylenders. Subdivision and fragmentation of land also made it difficult to effect improvements. In England and other European countries, the rich landlords often invested capital in their land to increase its productivity with a view to sharing in increased income. But in India, the absentee landlords, both old and new, performed no useful function. They were more rent receivers who had often no roots in the land and who took no personal interest in beyond collecting rent. They found it possible and therefore preferred to increase their income by further squeezing their tenants rather than by making productive investments in their lands. The government could have helped in improving and modernizing agriculture, but the government refused to recognize any such responsibility. The characteristic of financial system of British India was that while the main burden of taxation fell on the shoulders of the peasant, the government spent only a very small part of it on him. An example of this neglect was peasant and agriculture was the stepmotherly treatment meted out to public works and agricultural improvement. While the government of India had spent by 1905 over 360 crores of rupees on the railways which were demanded by British business interests, it spent the same period less than 50 crores of rupees on irrigation with which would have benefited millions of Indian cultivators. Even so, irrigation was only field in which the government took some steps forward. At time when agriculture all over the world was being modernized and revolutionized, Indian agriculture was technologically stagnating. Hardly any modern machinery was used. What was worse was that even ordinary implements were centuries old. For example, in 1951, there were only 9,30,000 iron plows in use, while wooden plows numbered 31.8 million. The use of inorganic fertilizers was virtually unknown, whereas a large part of animal manure, that is, cow dung, night soil, and cattle bones, was wasted. In 1922 to 3, only 1.9% of all cropped and land was under improved seeds. By 1938 and 9, this percentage had gone up to only 11%. Furthermore, agricultural education was completely neglected. In 1939, there were only 6 agricultural colleges with 1,306 students. There was not a single agricultural college in Bengal, Bihar, Odisha, and Sindh, nor could peasants make improvement through self study. There was hardly any spread of primary education or even literacy in rural areas. Development of modern industries. An important development in the second half of the 19th century was the establishment of large scale machine based industries in India. The machine age in India began when the cotton, textile, jute, and coal mining industries were started in 1850s. The first textile mill was started in Bombay by Kovasji Nanaboy in 1853 and the first jute mill in Rishra, Bengal in 1855. These industries expanded slowly but continuously. In 1879, there were 56 cotton textile mills in India employing nearly 43,000 persons. In 1882, there were 20 jute mills, most of them in Bengal, employing nearly 20,000 persons. By 1905, India had 206 cotton mills employing nearly 196,000 persons. In 1901, there were over 36 jute mills employing nearly 111,000 people. The coal mining industry employed nearly 1 lakh persons in 1906. Other mechanical industries developed during The second half of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century were cotton gins and presses, rice flour and timber mills, leather tanneries, woolen textiles, sugar mills, iron and steel works, and such mineral industries such as salt, mica, and saltpetre, cement, paper, matches, sugar, and glass industries developed during the 1930s. But all these industries had a very stunted growth. Most of the modern India industries were owned and controlled by the British capital. Foreign capitalists were attracted to Indian industry by prospects of high profits. Labor was extremely cheap. Raw materials were readily and cheaply available for many goods. India and its neighbors provided a ready market. For many Indian products such as tea, jute, manganese, there was a ready demand the world over. On the other hand, profitable investment opportunities at home were getting fewer. At the same time, the colonial government and officials were willing to provide all help and show all favors. Foreign capital easily overwhelmed Indian capital in many of the industries. Only in the cotton textile industry did Indians have a large share from the beginning. In the 1930s, the sugar industry was developed by Indians. Indian capitalists had also to struggle from the British beginning against the power of British managing agencies and British banks. To enter a field of enterprise, Indian businessmen had to bend before the British managing agencies dominating that field. In many cases, even Indian owned companies were controlled by foreign owned or controlled managing agents. India also found it difficult to get credit from banks, most of which were dominated by British financiers. Even when they could get loans, they had to pay high interest rates while foreigners could borrow on much easier terms. Of course, gradually Indians began to develop their own banks and insurance companies. In 1914, foreign banks held over 70% of all bank deposits in India. By 1937, their share had decreased to 57%. British enterprises in India also took advantage of its close connection with British suppliers of machinery and equipment, shipping, insurance companies, marketing agencies, government officials, and political leaders to maintain its dominant position in Indian economic life. Moreover, the government followed a conscious policy of favoring the foreign capital as against Indian capital. The railway police of the government also discriminated against the Indian enterprise. Railway freight rates encouraged foreign imports at the cost of trade in domestic products. It was also more difficult and costlier to distribute Indian goods than to distribute imported goods. Another serious weakness of the Indian industrial effort was the almost complete absence of heavier capital goods industries, without which there can be no rapid and independent development of industries. India had no big plants to produce iron and steel or to manufacture machinery. A few petty repair workshops represented engineering industries, and a few iron and brass foundries represented metallurgical industries. The first steel in India was produced only in 1913. Thus, India lacked such basic industries as steel, metallurgy, machine, chemical, and oil. India also lagged behind in development of electric power. Apart from machine-based industries in 19th century, also witnessed the growth of plantation industries such as indigo, tea, and coffee. They were almost exclusively European in ownership. Indigo was used as a dye in textile manufacturers. Indigo manufacture was introduced to India in end of 18th century and flourished in Bengal and Bihar. Indigo planters gained notoriety for their oppression over the peasants who were compelled by them to cultivate indigo. This operation was vividly portrayed in the famous Bengali writer Deenbandhu Mitra in his play Neel Darpan in 1860. The innovation of a synthetic dye gave a big blow to the indigo industry and it gradually declined. The tea industry developed in Assam, Bengal, South India, and the hills of Himachal Pradesh after 1850. Being foreign owned, it was held by the government with grants of rent free land and other facilities. In time, the use of tea spread all over India and it also became an important item of export. Coffee plantations developed during this period in South India. The plantation and other foreign owned industries were of hardly any advantage to Indian people. Their profits went out of the country. A large part of their salary bill was spent on highly paid foreign staff. They purchased most of their equipment abroad. Most of their technical staff was foreign. Most of their products were sold in foreign markets, and foreign exchange so earned was utilized by Britain. The only advantage that Indians got out of these industries was the creation of unskilled jobs. Most of the workers in these enterprises were, however, extremely low paid, and they worked under extremely harsh conditions for very long hours. Moreover, conditions of near slavery prevailed in the plantations. On whole, the industrial progress in India was exceedingly slow and painful. It was mostly confined to cotton and jute industries and tea plantations in the 19th century, and to sugar and cement in the 1930s. As late as 1946, cotton and jute textiles accounted for 40% of all workers employed in factories. In terms of production as well as employment, the modern industrial development of India was paltry compared to the economic development of other countries or with India's economic needs. It did not, in fact, compensate even for the displacement of the indigenous handicrafts. It had little effect on the problems of poverty and overcrowding of land. The paltriness of Indian industrialization is brought out by the fact that out of a population of 357 million in 1951, only about 2.3 million were employed in modern industrial enterprises. Furthermore, the decay and decline of the urban and rural handicraft industries continued unabated after 1858. The Indian Planning Commission has calculated that the number of persons engaged in processing and manufacturing fell from 10.3 million in 1901 to 8.8 million in 1951, even though the population increased by nearly 40%. The government made no effort to protect, rehabilitate, reorganize, and modernize these old indigenous industries. Moreover, even the modern industries had to develop without government help and often opposition to British policy. The British manufacturers looked upon Indian textile and other industries as their rivals and put pressure on the government of India to not encourage but rather to actively discourage industrial development in India. Thus, British policy artificially restricted and slowed down the growth of Indian industries. Furthermore, Indian industries, still in the period of infancy, needed protection. They developed at a time when Britain, France, Germany, and United States had already established powerful industries and could therefore compete with them. In fact, all other countries, including Britain, had protected their infant industries by imposing heavy custom duties on import of foreign manufacturers. But India was not a free country. Its policies were determined by in Britain and in interests of the British industrialists who forced a policy of free trade upon their colony. For the same reason, the government of India refused to give financial or other help to the newly founded Indian industry as was being done at the time by the governments of Europe and Japan for their own infant industries. It would not even make adequate arrangements for technical education, which remained extremely backward until 1951 and further contributed to industrial backwardness. In 1939, there were only 7 engineering colleges with 2217 students in the country. Many Indian projects, for example, those concerning with the construction of ships, locomotives, cars, aeroplanes, could not get started because of the government's refusal to give any help. Finally, in the 1920s and 30s, under the pressure of the rising nationalist movement and Indian capitalist class, the government of India was forced to grant some tariff protection to Indian industries. But once again, the government discriminated against the Indian owned industries. The Indian owned industries such as cement, iron, steel, glass were denied protection or gave inadequate protection. On the other hand, foreign dominated industries such as the match industry were given protection as they desired. Moreover, British imports were given special privileges under the system of imperial preferences, even though Indians protested vehemently. Another feature of Indian industrial development was that it was extremely lopsided regionally. Indian industries were concentrated only in few regions of cities of the country. Large parts of the country remained totally underdeveloped. This unequal regional economic development not only led to the wide regional disparities in income but also affected the level of national integration. It made the task of creating a unified Indian nation more difficult. An important social consequence of even the limited industrial development of the country was the birth and growth of two new social classes in Indian society: the industrial capitalist class and the modern working class. These two classes were entirely new in Indian history because modern mines, industries, and even means of transport were new. Even though these classes were formed a very small part of the Indian population, they represented new technology, a new system of economic organization, a new social relations, new ideas, and new outlook. They were not weighed down by the burden of old traditions, customs, and styles of life. Most of all, they possessed all India outlook. Moreover, both of them were vitally interested in the industrial development of the country. Their economic and political importance and roles were therefore out of all proportion to their numbers. Thank you everyone for tuning in. This was part 2, chapter number 8 of economic impact of British rule. Next, we will be talking about poverty and famines in the next part. Thank you all for tuning in. All the best, everyone.